Okay, everybody. So we will go ahead and jump in with today's micro session. I'm Danessa Gates, and today's session is titled Why You Don't Feel Burned Out Until It's Too Late. So, have you ever had the experience where you're functioning, you're handling everything, you're showing up, and then suddenly you hit a wall? Not gradually, not predictably, just all at once. And what's confusing is you didn't feel burned out before that. Most people think burnout builds in a way that you can feel, like you get tired, or you feel overwhelmed, or you recognize the signs early. But that's not actually how it works, especially for high performers, because what high performers are very good at is not feeling it in real time. So the pattern is burnout doesn't start when you feel exhausted. It starts when your system begins doing something very specific, and that is overriding internal signals to maintain performance. And if you're high functioning, you can do that for a very long time. Some of us for decades, right? So, and this is where people will usually ask me, so are you saying I was burned out and didn't know it? Yes, but not in the way people think, right? You weren't incapable. You weren't falling apart. You were actually performing really well, which is exactly why it goes unnoticed. So think about this reframe. Burnout isn't always, I can't keep going. Sometimes it's, I've been going without interruption for too long. So, as an example, to make this real, right? You're handling everything, you're responding quickly, you're staying on top of things, you're being reliable, and none of that feels like a problem until all of a sudden you can't focus, you don't want to engage, and everything feels heavier than it should. And this is where people will often ask me, well, but wouldn't I notice that building? Not if your system isn't trained for this. Because what your system is doing is compressing signals in real time. So you feel something, let's say it's fatigue or it's hesitation or it's resistance, and then you move past it immediately. So what's happening is instead of registering what's going on and what you're feeling, you just override it. It boils down to burnout doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from what you don't register while you're doing it. So I want to make sure that lands, right? So let me repeat that. Burnout doesn't come from doing too much. It comes from what you don't register while it's happening. High performers don't burn out because they're weak. They burn out because they can sustain performance while disconnected from their internal state. And this is where people go, okay, so what does that actually look like, Danessa? It looks like you're tired, but you keep going. You need a break, but you just push through. You already know you're at capacity, but you take on just one more thing. And it's not even because you have to, it's because you can. So the practical shift here isn't do less, it's notice earlier. So that means starting to ask, where am I already overriding something small? Because as you can see, burnout isn't one big moment, it's a series of missed signals that accumulate. And so I might get a question at this point that says, okay, but how do I actually do that? How do I catch this earlier? And safe to say, it's not by trying to monitor everything. Okay. Because if you try to track every signal, you're just going to overwhelm yourself even more. It's actually much simpler than that. You start by noticing the smallest moment you move past something, you override something, right? So that's what you start noticing. That simple, smallest moment where you just moved past something. Not the big burnout moment, the small one. The moment where you think, I'm fine, I'll just keep going. That's the moment. That's where that pattern shifts. And just to be really clear about this, again, it's not about catching everything perfectly, right? You're not trying to suddenly be hyper aware of every little thing. You're just starting to notice before the override becomes automatic. That's it. So, to close this out today, because the goal is not avoiding burnout early, what we're attempting to do is to become someone who can recognize what's happening while it's happening, not after the fact. So, again, you're trying to become someone who can recognize what's happening while it's happening, not after it's already happened, not after the fact. And if this resonates, I'd be curious, where do you notice yourself overriding signals before things build and accumulate? And next week, I'll be following and I'm going to build on this because one of the biggest patterns I see is people feel completely fine until you have that moment, and suddenly you don't feel fine, right? So we're going to break down why that shift happens so fast. All right. That's today's micro session. I hope to see you in next week's.